Hello and welcome to tonight's talk. How appropriate that the last talk about Arnhem ended with an image of a Commonwealth War grave, because this evening Phil Wilkinson is going to talk to us about the organisation. He will be joining David at the end for a live Q&A, so please do stay for that. If you feel able to donate, please do this evening, because it's only with your donations that we're able to continue with these talks and indeed work on things like our medal displays. Many thanks, and I hope you enjoy this evening.
So it's just over 100 years now since the end of that appallingly destructive First World War. After that ceremonial flurry, there were bookstores and TV screens overflowing with studies, with assessments, and all of them at one time or another came up with the realization that there were so many people denied a natural lifespan, millions left in the mud of Flanders, on the beaches of Turkey, across the deserts of Mesopotamia, or just at the bottom of the sea, a dreadful commentary on the ability of man to be inhuman to man. But one bright light shines through these otherwise depressing reflections. It's the light thrown by the inspirational vision and energies of a man too old to serve in that 1914-18 war. This fellow, Fabian Ware. And it's for sure that although the emphasis of these centenary commemorations, similarly back in 2020 when we got to the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second War, they all reflected on the brutal cutting down of a young generation across the whole of the British Empire. Indeed, on the many more lost from the Allied countries, and we must not ever forget those lost from the Central Powers. The graves of those young people remain as a symbol of some much higher human aspiration. And I'm going to take a look at a number of those graves, at those cemeteries, at those memorials all across Europe and Asia. But first of all, a look at the single-minded and irrepressible dedication of this man, Fabian Ware. And I can add, without any commission coming my way, that there's a fairly recent book about him called Empires of the Dead, if you want to look in much greater detail into his life. But back to him. Fabian Arthur Gulston Ware, to give him his full set, was born in Bristol, June 1869, educated privately and then at universities in London and Paris. And after 10 years teaching at secondary schools in Yorkshire, he began contributing to the newspaper The Morning Post, today's Daily Telegraph. In 1900, he obtained a position as Assistant Director of Education in the Transvaal in South Africa. 2 years later, he entered the Transvaal Legislative Council and was made Director of Education under a very important patron of his, Lord Milner. And in 1905, he was invited to become the editor of the Morning Post. So he was moving on fast and fitted this post with distinction, but resigned again in 1911 to go and join Lord Milner on the board of the Rio Tinto Company. A little digression on this Milner man, a man of certainly many parts, who was going to be later War Minister to Lloyd George in the War Cabinet, and thus a predecessor of Winston Churchill in that post. And I have to say, as a small advertisement, cutting across to another topic I might cover on a later date, he led a mission, did Lord Milner, to Russia in February 1917, just prior to the revolution, to assess the feasibility and necessity of supplying aid to Russia as the war continued. We'll move off from Russia, however, and go back to Ware, who, upon the outbreak of war in 1914, discovered that, yes, indeed, at 45, he was too old to be accepted by the army for active service. And once again, with his patron's help, Lord Milner's help, he was appointed to command a mobile unit of the British Red Cross Society. He travelled to France, arriving in September 1914, so thus only weeks into the war, and set up his headquarters in Lille. Interestingly, currently the British headquarters, the headquarters of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in France is based at Arras, with offices in Lille, and my granddaughter has just finished working for them on an internship from university. Fascinating place. If you get to Arras in particular, go and see the War Graves Experience exhibition. But he'd set up his headquarters, and in addition to setting up also a field hospital, he told his team, quite a small one, to go out and collect information on where the dead had been buried, to take precise notes on the location of every cemetery. Obviously, most of these were domestic French cemeteries. This was not a new activity, of course, but what was new was the growth of interest in the care of the graves themselves, because Fabian Ware had seen for himself the neglect of so many burial sites across South Africa during the years following the Boer War, and he foresaw that there would be pilgrimages after the possibly, we all hoped, very short war. But very soon after Ware's arrival, he was visited by the Red Cross medical assessor, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, and Ware took him to the town cemetery of Bethune, where a number of British graves were already in place. The graves were headed, as you can see there on the screen, with either a simple or a slightly decorated pencil marking on a wooden cross, with accurate listing of names and locations of burials, very much a matter of chance, relying mostly on the French civil authorities' record keeping. So early in 1915, Ware gained official approval for his unit to mark and register all the graves it could find, and for finding them, having found them, I should say, tending them, the major shift in attitudes to these battlefield burials, the care of the graves. It was a decision that chimed with the growing pressure at home in Britain for something to be done about the graves of the now several thousand of dead across France and Belgium. So Ware now began what was to become the work of, yes indeed, the rest of his life. To get round some of the bureaucratic traps of mixing civilian and military agencies' work, he was given the army rank of major. He and two principal assistants then were officially entitled the Graves Registration Commission. And General Macready, who was the Adjutant General of the British Expeditionary Force, had a word with Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, making sure that he understood the scale of the task, thus guaranteeing proper top-level cover for what Ware was now going to be embarking on. Progress was striking. In just 6 months, from May to October, the Commission had registered over 31,000 graves, and this meant finding, locating, marking the burial sites, and where necessity, erecting the wooden cross, suitably and permanently inscribed, not just penciled. Once this was done, there was then the whole business of registering the details, and back at headquarters the details were put up in two lists, one for regimental or other affiliation and classification, the second for grave location, and the numbers included. Much more significant, though, in the long run, was Ware's negotiations with the French ministries, the Ministry of War and the Ministry of the Interior, to acquire land for the burial of Allied soldiers. We can no longer rely on local cemeteries around churches. We've got to start building. So Ware described the eventual and rapidly achieved agreement as more than generous, since the offer from France was made of both land and of maintenance thereafter of the cemeteries. The final decision, in fact, was Britain would accept the gift of land in perpetuity, but retain responsibility for the upkeep. The sites were carefully chosen, avoiding taking too much agricultural land and, wherever possible, keeping as far as possible a reasonable distance from domestic housing. But not everyone at home in Britain agreed with Ware's philosophical view that the battlefield, his view, was where officers and men shared the same horrors, and that they should therefore be buried alongside each other. Some wealthy families were arranging for exhumations, repatriation of bodies, and Ware prevailed on that Adjutant General, General Macready, and he ordered no more exhumations, not only on grounds of hygiene, but also, quote, on account of the difficulties of treating impartially the claims by persons of different social standing. The next element of the work was to satisfy requests from relatives to have a photograph of the burial site. Ware thought this should be done, and the Red Cross, marvellously, undertook to fund the task. Prints were sent to the relatives, accompanied with a card that gave the best available indications of how to locate the site, and if it was near a large-scale cemetery, directions from the nearest railway station. Because Ware now realised that there would be a mass of visits after the war, forethought indeed. Things were moving ahead, though, because by spring 1916 the Commission had been renamed as the Directorate of Grave Registration, and this reflected the terrific flow of requests for these grave site details. And at the same time, the work of the Directorate was being extended to other theatres of war, not just France, not just Belgium, but with units out in Salonika, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia. And Ware embarked on yet another strand of the work, horticultural policy. We'll come back to that. There was a newly instituted National Committee for the Care of Soldiers' Graves, and interestingly too, the Prince of Wales was its patron and president. This committee was given official recognition and was, in effect, the precursor of the Imperial War Graves Commission. And the assistant director of Kew Gardens went to France and advised on planting, and by mid-1916, Ware's unit had provisionally selected some 200 permanent cemetery sites. By early 1917, it was clear to Ware and to Macready, that Adjutant General, and also to the Prince of Wales, that there would be a need for a formal organisation to look after the graves after the war. There was a bit of a turf war here, with the Office of Works, who were the government department that looked after public buildings and parks, and also already had responsibility for Crimean cemeteries and some in the Far East. There was a lot to be said for this view, putting the government department in, but Macready and Ware thought that as they said, the intimate nature of the future work needed something other than a standard government department, with all that usually brings. Then there was the notion of empire, and the appropriate imperial body that would be able to include representatives of all the nations that had given their lives in the war. And Lloyd George agreed, and a royal charter establishing the Imperial War Graves Commission was signed into being on the 21st of May 1917. The first full meeting of the Commission was in November that year, with High Commissioners representing Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, plus reps from the offices, the domestic London offices of the Ministry of War, Minister for the Colonies, and of course the India office. And at that meeting were also the chief engineer of the Aswan Dam, Sir William Garstin, and also, very interestingly indeed, Rudyard Kipling. Now these two, Garstin and Kipling, had both already lost sons in the war. And some of the fundamentals were set in concrete at that meeting. For example, the direction that there should be no distinction between the graves of officers and men, a considerable break from previous tradition, where officers had individual graves with the men in mass burials. There was another element of departure in that the scheme was designed to commemorate these men in perpetuity. Now that was what the great and the good had had in the past in cathedrals, and so on. Ordinary folk, of course, might have a churchyard burial, but we all know, sadly, how sadly and quickly those can fall into disrepair. So now they had to put something into practice. They would need horticulturalists, they'd need engineers, they'd need architects, they'd need artists, but above all, they should have designers. Who should they be? Well, Fabian Ware had already set the ball rolling. He'd invited Charles Aitken, director of the main London gallery that is now, in fact, Tate Britain, plus leading architects, Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker, to go to the battle zone, see the nature of the problem, and make some recommendations. Lutyens and Baker had diametrically opposed views. Abstract forms was Lutyens' style, symbolism was Baker, but with a cross for him central to the philosophy of the cemeteries. This clash, plus Aitken, the Tate Britain director, harping on about keeping costs to a minimum, led Ware to us go and consult with the Prince of Wales, who wanted all this argument kept out of the public domain. So Ware invited Sir Frederick Kenyon, a British museum director, to be advisor to the Commission on architectural treatment and on the layout of cemeteries. He was a former soldier as well as a cultural guru, and he made a first suggestion that wear should be advanced in military rank. So work now moves ahead at a terrific pace. By February 1918, the concept for uniform headstones was established. Provision was made there for there to be sensitive treatment of different creeds and their established methods of burial or disposal of bodies, and Kenyon made 2 extended visits to the battle areas in France and Belgium. Here, the signs are clear of the way a battlefield looks. And he reported back in crystal clear fashion on items that have fashioned the Commission's work ever since. He commented on the missing, on the unidentified. It would be impossible to provide every body with a personal headstone, but there should be a memorial to the lost, to the unknown, the not forgotten dead. And he also summed up his personal vision of the cemeteries. And he said,
"The general appearance of a British cemetery will be that of an enclosure with plots of grass or flowers, or both, separated by paths of varying size and set with orderly rows of headstones, uniform in height and width. Shrubs and trees will be arranged in various places, sometimes as clumps at the junctions of ways, sometimes as avenues along the sides of the principal paths, sometimes around the borders of the cemetery. The graves will, wherever possible, face towards the east, and at the eastern end of the cemetery will be a great altar stone, raised upon broad steps and bearing some brief and appropriate phrase or text. Either over the stone or elsewhere in the cemetery will be a small building where visitors may gather for shelter or for worship, and where the register of the graves will be kept. And at some prominent spot will rise the cross, as the symbol of the Christian faith and of the self-sacrifice of the men who now lie beneath its shadow."
Now that's almost 100% the scene that will greet the visitor to any Commonwealth War Graves site today. Just consider the strength of Kenyon's report. What he and his small team encountered across France and Belgium was quite simply devastation. And Kenyon wrote in his report, "The land is now a wilderness of shell holes, overgrown with rank vegetation, cumbered with barbed wire, with bombs and shells and fragments half buried all over it, and sown thickly with burials." Now, I'm almost done with this early history, leaving that in view. But I got to mention the final details of what you will see today if and when you next visit a Commonwealth War Graves site anywhere in the world. Kenyon's report, in its full detail, was presented to a meeting of the Commission in London in February 1918. Every one of its recommendations was accepted. For example, he identified Edwin Lutyens, we've seen him before, and Herbert Baker, who'd, as we've heard, already done their own battlefield reconnaissance, together with a third architect, Sir Reginald Blomfield. They would supervise the work of 6 juniors, and in selection of these juniors, preferences would be given to those who had served during the war. One such was a chap called Wilfred Clement von Berg, and he later recalled, "In France in early 1919, I was awaiting demobilization and wondering rather grimly what were likely to be my prospects of re-entering my profession in England, when a notice arrived in my orderly room stating that architects were invited to apply for positions in the Imperial War Graves Commission. Without a moment's hesitation, I saddled my horse, galloped off to a neighbouring town, was interviewed and accepted." Brilliant. In all, just as well, because he designed nearly 40 cemeteries, including this most beautiful Bedford House Cemetery near Ypres. And here's a symbol of how this has to have had its impact, because in this beautiful cemetery, we have 5,139 lost men commemorated, of whom only 3,000 are identified. 2 of the most enduring symbols, both as recommended by Kenyon, had been designed by 2 of these 3 senior architects. And these are Blomfield's Cross of Sacrifice and Edwin Lutyens' Stone of Remembrance. And Lutyens set out his design in precise terms. One great fair stone of fine proportions, 12 feet in length, lying raised upon 3 steps, of which the first and third should be twice the width of the second, precisely as it appears. Blomfield's freestanding cross is a pretty much straightforward Christian symbol, reflecting the majority religion of the time. His centrally mounted bronze sword emphasises the military heart of the device. He was content that it should be adapted in size or height, it balanced the scale of a cemetery, but Lutyens insisted that his stone would always be the same size. 3 cemeteries were chosen to be worked on as experiments in form and design. These were at Le Tréport near Dieppe, at Louvancourt, and at Forceville on the Somme. Blomfield designed them all, and the most successful was assessed as being Forceville. This set the pattern for the future and gave a first chance to start assessing the cost of the work. And we must also remember the input of Rudyard Kipling, who was the Commissioner's literary advisor from 1917 to 1936. In November 1918, he defined the wording for the stone. For those who want to check it out, this is in Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus chapter 44, verse 13, where, having mentioned that the dead are buried, it says, "Their name liveth for evermore." That was the one that Kipling picked up. And he also composed the wording for the headstones of the unidentified, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God, as these 3 views show. And indeed, as the last one shows, this was a sequence that was now carrying on into the Second World War, although not known at the time that Kipling chose it. The next final element was the method of marking the hundreds of thousands of the missing, no known grave. Of the 3 principal architects, both Baker and Lutyens had previous form. Baker had produced this Kimberley Memorial in 1904 at the end of the Boer War, after the war, and Lutyens with his own memorial in Johannesburg, which is a 1911 structure. Again, their styles can be seen as different. In the event, it was neither of those, but it was Blomfield who acquired the first mass memorial commission, in his case for the Menin Gate. But once it was realised that this would only hold a maximum of just 60,000 names, the way opened for a whole range of large-scale monuments and memorials. Baker added the Tyne Cot Memorial with 35,000 names. Lutyens was the creator of the Thiepval Memorial with the names of over 72,000 missing from the Battle of the Somme. Commonwealth Empire monuments also started to South African dead. Here at 3 views of the Delville Wood Cemetery. Here the Delville Wood as it starts to show its horror in 1916, and then the development of these very tasteful memorials. For South Africa, here the Indians have their own style. In Neuve-Chapelle, the Canadians up there on Vimy Ridge, the Newfoundland contingents on Beaumont-Hamel, and the Australians at Villers-Bretonneux, the last one to be dedicated and completed before the Second War started, just in time. The King, George VI, unveiled it in late July 1938. One short aside on horticulture, Gertrude Jekyll, possibly well known to many, had collaborated with Lutyens on any number of projects since 1899, and she came into the design team and was responsible for several cemeteries, of which the most often mentioned, as a typical one, is this one at Varlamont-Alt in the Pas-de-Calais. It was her sense of the Englishness of the country garden that determined the appearance of today's cemeteries. But overseas, of course, there could be no English country garden, yet the challenge of coping with all the difficult climatic or terrain challenges have been remarkably well met and generally overcome. And so the Commission across the world settled into a program of routine care and maintenance. Thus, as we can see, such progress going on in India, in Germany, in Singapore, in the lovely region of Calvados in France, more again in India, in Athens. I can report absolutely on the skill of that particular tractor driver. Further north in Narvik in Norway. Much the same year I saw Athens, I was in Narvik as well. Care and maintenance, as it says here, so that you can look as you arrive, as you think, as you reflect, and as you leave. That is a little cemetery at Rancourt, It's the same cemetery taken from a different angle as the one in my title slide, which is repeated here. And you move through France and carry on this worldwide look at Rangoon, further into Thailand, into Malta. See the different styles, everything, all the challenges that have been met so well at Boscon Cemetery in Italy. A very similar cemetery in Italy in terms of lineup, but in snow. Similar lineup in Egypt, not much snow there. Across to Gallipoli, where here we see once again the work that has to be done to make sure the terrain will stand whatever is being put there, where the vertical headstones will not be maintainable, and therefore we find slabs on the ground. There'll be some others. Back to India, notice again the scribing on the texts. We have native languages as well as the British language describing who is there. Back to Gallipoli again. Across to Thailand, where again we see slabs down. And at Umtafa in Malta, again, very, very big slabs, but different size, different style. Conventionally in Singapore, conventionally in Crete, Alexandria, these endless places in Penang. Back again to the Athens Memorial in summertime, what was this, 2015. Little across the Black Sea, the Dardanelles, we come into Istanbul, and this extraordinary Victorian structure in the Haydar Pasha Cemetery, a very important place indeed for many reasons. Its links back to the Crimea and all the way to the present day. There's a wonderful plaque there. This is to the memory, it says, of the officers and men of the British Army and Navy who in the war against Russia in 1854, 1855 and 1856 died for their country. This monument was raised by Queen Victoria and her people, and the date 1857. There's also a tribute to Florence Nightingale there, and that will show up well enough on the screen. I will let you read it. Significant enough to say that Queen Victoria raised the first one, as it says here, in 1954, from the people and Her Majesty, the then Queen Elizabeth II, were the sponsors of this plaque that was put up by the British community in Turkey. Fascinating how times have moved on. I moved on. This is far, far north from Istanbul in the Faroe Islands. Back again into the Bay of Bengal, halfway between Calcutta and Penang, on the middle of the Andaman Islands where I was visiting. There is a little Catholic churchyard. Strange place to find a Catholic churchyard, but there it is. 7 British military headstones tucked away, and visibly so, in a nice straight line, well tended, miles from anywhere. Back to mainland Europe and little village churchyards, like this one in Calvados, this one in Normandy, Varangeville. One single man is there. A significant church if you get the chance to visit, with artistic and other elements to it which make it quite breathtaking. Back home, of course, in English village churchyards. Here's one captioned in Essex. Here, in my own village back in Hampshire at Upper Clatford, there is a mark of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission on the lich gate, and therefore you'll know something's inside, and indeed there are 7, including these, sadly, brothers in arms, 2 flight engineers of the Royal Air Force. The younger brother follows the first, and I'm afraid followed him in the same sad way. But I guess Sir Frederick Kenyon had it absolutely right in 1918. As he says on this slide, those who are interested, and hundreds of thousands must be deeply and poignantly interested. I'll let you read on. But it's the business at the end, paying tribute in reverence and honour due to those who've fallen for their country. Commemorative tributes. Here's a fine example, with me on the left of that pair of people, further to the middle of the picture, on the 1st of September 1989. Not a particularly significant date, except for Poles, it was the day that the Germans invaded in 1939, so we're 50 years on. This is in Berlin, September 89. The wall is still up. That Polish air attaché who'd come from their mission in East Berlin to pay tribute to the number of Polish airmen dead and buried over Berlin, from combat over Berlin, lying now in the British war cemetery, the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in West Berlin. He had turned up sadly without flowers of his own, so he and I, therefore, carrying my standard British Legion wreath, held hands, effectively marched forward and put our wreath down together. We saluted, turned away, and in fact at the end of the afternoon he wandered back through the wall into East Berlin, and we didn't expect to see each other again until 2 months later. Suddenly it was all over. The wall was down, the Communist Party was falling apart, the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact were disassembling, and I was going to meet Polish comrades and colleagues in Moscow in my attaché duties. I won't go any further into that. That's a different story altogether. But consider the youth of that Polish community in the east of Berlin came across. Young people came and paid their tributes at the stone where their name liveth forevermore in British and in the Polish tongue. So, commemoration. Roncourt, we're back here again. We've been here before. That's that small cemetery, the small British one. Just across the field is the very, very considerably larger French cemetery. Also next to it is a memorial chapel, a French memorial chapel, but with a central core that is based upon a tribute from an American-born, nonetheless, French woman who wanted to have her son and his loss represent the loss to all the mothers of France. She browbeat the French authorities, and this chapel was established in the 1930s. So we've got a little British cemetery, a gigantic French one, and just indeed beside that is the German cemetery. And a German cemetery, of course. There's a German cemetery in Moscow, and I would go often with my German counterpart while I was being attaché, and we would go and look to the details of his German cemetery on any of their days of remembrance, and he would come to the British Church in the middle of Moscow on Remembrance Sunday, and we would stand side by side, because this is what this is all about. In Prague, when I was visiting, I could go to the British cemetery there. Having laid a wreath at various headstones there, I'd move across to the Soviet cemetery, where indeed they have a very similar style, rather more flamboyant, and indeed they also step that one place further, unlike the British mode, which is to bury their officers separately, and in the case of the senior officers like this one, he is after all a Guards Division Major General, hero of the Soviet Union. He does definitely deserve, I think, some recognition, but we have decided to do it a different way. Here's another way of commemorating, and again in Russia. This is a British service man whose 102nd birthday on the 28th of December 2022 is an extraordinary thing to celebrate, and I'm happy to have been able to do it with him. He was part of a 1941 Royal Air Force deployment to Russia. Some were lost. I was able to take him back up there to Murmansk in 2005, and he could lay a small tribute at one of the graves up there in, again, a Commonwealth War Graves location. There's another one in Murmansk, slightly less tasteful, in a bit of an industrial site, and it's a brick-walled enclosure, not much more than that. And I took another veteran in 2006, veteran also of that 1941 deployment, and he was able to stand and consider the tributes to fallen British service people. In Archangel, further east and further north, is the British Commonwealth Grave collection in Archangel, where in 1993 I was able to take part in the formal burial of remains of a Royal Air Force crew lost in 1943 on the way to do some damage to the Tirpitz. Full military honours accorded by the Russians, with a Navy band and an Army firing party, and relatives of those missing Royal Air Force men gathered from all round the world. Quite extraordinary. And when I was back, a few years back, there are the now new granite headstones for those missing British airmen. The work continues all the time. This was work that was going on in the 1990s. Further into the 21st century, we've got these Chinook lifts of a large memorial coming to the site of a aircraft crash and death many years ago, no longer standing on its own amongst a pile of rocks. We have a full, proper tribute being dedicated by a Royal Air Force chaplain, again with family members very carefully transported to the top of that remote mountain site. The work does continue all the time. When I was in that Haydar Pasha cemetery, I could find, first of all, the interesting co-location of the stone and the cross, a little piece of architectural design which is, I think, unique to the War Graves Commission. But there was considerable work going on to lay some new slabs on a memorial plinth, which again refers to some of these strange adventures of British servicemen in Russia in distant years, in 1918, 1919, 1920. What were we still doing there? The last Brits left from the Crimea in Easter 1920. Some of them didn't leave. Some of them were shot, dead, killed, drowned, sickness, in all kinds of parts of the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, the south of Asia. And they are commemorated because their graves have long since disappeared. They're commemorated here in the Haydar Pasha Cemetery in Istanbul. And there's a memorial panel which mentions their names, and you'll see just how interestingly different their units and their places of original burial are. If you leave the Haydar Pasha, you go past once again that Victorian column, and once you've gone through the railway station just beyond and into the dockyard area to get on the ferry to go back, just in the left-hand side of the image, you'll see the column again, just behind the docks, and just below what is now obviously refurbished and remodeled and renewed, the Scutari Hospital, where Florence Nightingale was so active. So it's all tied together from the 1850s to the 21st century. All down to this man, who by the end of the Second War was 76. As it says on his list of gongs, he came up the scale. He was in the Michael and St George in 1917, the Bath in 1919, British Empire 1920, and a Knight of the Victorian Order in 1922. He was a Chevalier and later a Grand Officier of the Légion d'Honneur. He held the Croix de Guerre. He was also a Commander of the Order of the Crown of Belgium. He was an Honorary Doctor of Letters in 1929 at the University of Aberdeen. He retired in 1948. He died a year later. He's buried in Gloucestershire. He's commemorated in Westminster Abbey with just a small tablet in the Warriors' Chapel. But his real memorial is out there, where it will continue to draw us, you, lots of people, I have to imagine, draw people in for the rest of time, because their name liveth forevermore. And that does bring me to the end of this, I hope, interesting and stimulating talk, and I hope there'll be some questions. There may very well be some questions that I can answer, there may well be some that I can't. But all I would like to say is thank you for this opportunity, and thank you very much for all being an audience. Thank you.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in to ask a question.
Good evening, hello there, and thank you very much for joining the live Q&A now. I'm David Innes, a trustee of the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, and I'm delighted to be joined by Phil Wilkinson, who gave us that splendid talk just now. Looking forward to your questions. One or two have come in already. I just thought you'd like to know that watching over proceedings from behind me is Captain Ralph Kite, MC. An officer of the 52nd, the 2nd Battalion of the Oxfordshire Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, mortally wounded on the Somme in November 1916. He died at 3.5 weeks later. He lies in Le Tréport, Commonwealth War Graves Commission Cemetery, and that was one of the cemeteries mentioned by you, Phil, as the trial, one of the trial cemeteries, which you mentioned. We've got a first question here from Vanessa Cameron, actually. How many Commonwealth War Graves Commission locations are to be found around the world? You went through a tremendous array of photographs, lovely photographs of many of them, but there must be lots more to be
Well, indeed.
Yeah.
I could have gone on for a lot longer. Approximately 23,500 locations worldwide, of which half are in the UK. And you think 12,000 cemeteries. Well, of course, we're looking at individual headstones in a village churchyard all the way through to the mass sort of cemetery arrangement that you'd find at Brookwood. Similarly, across the world, of those 12,000 non-British ones, there are, of course, a considerable number in France and Belgium, the principal locations of those First War and indeed the Second War combat losses. But there are some other interesting places. There's one in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, for example. There's a few in Sweden. There's one in Nigeria, and so on and so on. Just about anywhere you go, You're not far from one. Such is the spread of the British armed forces over the years.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for that. Of course, we are the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, and so I need to ask, as a sort of follow-up to Vanessa's question there, how many there are in Oxfordshire? How many cemeteries there are in Oxfordshire? How many graves are there in Oxfordshire?
Well, I can't answer for the entire number, but let's take the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry.
Yeah, that's a good regiment to take.
Well, indeed, and there are a good number of locations, 60 perhaps, in Oxfordshire. Of course, again, many of those are going to be individual churchyard burials in the bigger cemeteries like Botley and places where there had been military hospitals or concentrations from hospital activity. So there's a couple of hundred around Oxfordshire itself. But the mass of, I'm afraid, the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry, in excess of 7,300, are around the world.
Yep.
The majority, as one might expect, are in France, some 3,500. But then they are here, there, and everywhere. I have to refer to a list. But for example, there are a few in 17 Ox and Bucks boys down in Tunisia. There's one in Malaysia. There's one in Gibraltar. 4 in Nigeria. There are several hundred in Italy. You know, the numbers up, down, and they are all over the place. 7,369. And then there's the, of course, slightly smaller complement from a smaller outfit, the Queen's own Oxfordshire Hussars, the QOOH, or as I discovered in researching today, the Queer Objects on Horseback. There's 160 of them buried around the place, and I've got some interesting stories about some of them.
That is indeed a county regiment, and one we're very proud of at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. Ted Evely has come in with a question. Phil, a fascinating talk, thank you. You mentioned earlier World War I burials in local French and Belgian churchyards. Were Kenyon and the Commission able to rely on local resources to tend these graves by the Commission?
Well, it was a transfer of responsibility. The lead was taken certainly by France, and with Ware making sure that, Fabian Ware making sure that the questions were being put in the right places. The Belgian authorities, of course, were slightly less established, but the same theory arrived, and the business of the land being given and the maintenance being retained by Britain is how it continued. The very earliest burials, of course, were, as I think I said in the lecture, were in village churchyards or village cemeteries, and they were gathered together by the local residents who had to work with British Army recovery teams and sanitary teams to get the bodies safely away.
Thank you very much for that. David Brown asks a question here. How does the Commonwealth War Graves Commission as a body think of the researchers who try to identify some of the unknowns which are buried in various cemeteries? We're talking about the JCCC and organisations like that, I guess, aren't we?
Yes, it is an extraordinary arrangement. And I think, yes, I did mention it. My granddaughter has had the great pleasure and challenge of working within the Commission's France headquarters in Arras. And she was given very interesting insights into the work of these forensic teams. And my son, who's currently the military attaché in Paris and sees a lot of French burial sites, and ceremonials, in particular the reburials of eventually identified remains.
Yes.
And it is the work of that very significantly detailed work by that very, very expert team that is able eventually to be unequivocal. That is the remain or the remains of soldier, airman, sailor, A, B, or C.
Yeah.
And then the commission swings in and headstones are prepared and so forth. It's a terrific process. And that, if I think I mentioned again, if you happen to be going through Arras, which is a nice place to go anyway, go and see this Commonwealth War Graves Experience exhibition and their various visible sites of gravestone preparation, the masonry work, the carving work, the establishment of repair shops and so on. I mean, it's an extraordinary arrangement. It all goes back to this extraordinary 45-year-old in 1914 who thought it was going to be necessary to do something like this, a bit of inspired thought.
In the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, we are very proud of a particular story of a 52nd officer, Osmond Bartle Wordsworth, who is a descendant of the poet, whose remains were thought to lie in a graveyard in France, but there was no certain identification until 2013, I think it was, when some bones turned up in a garden, in a French garden, and with those was a positive identification. DNA played a part in this, but also some artifacts, and the graveyard where we thought he lay has now been confirmed, and he is no longer known unto God. He is now Lieutenant Osmond Bartle Wordsworth of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. And that took, from the time the bones were found in 2013 to last year, 9 years to identify.
Brilliant.
And we hope to tell that story, actually, in an online talk later this year.
Oh, well, I shall look forward to seeing that.
Thank you very much indeed for that question. Chris Davis. Chris, you're becoming a regular follower of these talks, and I'm delighted to see you again, cropping up here again tonight. Excellent talk, thank you. Can you say something about the different designs of the stones? Chris Davis is a sapper officer. He knows about stone. I understand the shape of the shoulders is significant, he says.
It's, I wish I could give an accurate and 100% accurate answer. Yes, it is a shape that I think is worked on to provide the best possible runoff of all those things that drop on headstones of that shape. And indeed, the material from which they're cast or carved has to again be as robust as the likely expected climatic conditions will allow. So we are Portland stone and other stone and the granites that you'll see in, more often than not, somewhere, for example, in the Murmansk and the Archangel cemeteries, they are very much granite objects because that's expected to be most easily able to withstand the cold and horridness. As to the precise ownership of design of that headstone shape, I really can't say that I know that answer, and I'm sorry, Chris.
I'm going to interrupt the Q&A just for a moment to request your donations. We are very grateful to everybody who makes a donation as a result of our online talks. Thank you very much indeed. All I'm saying now is please don't forget it, because it means everything to us. We are sponsored tonight by an anonymous donor, and we're very chuffed with that. Their generosity allows us to keep your donations for the work that goes on in the museum, as Ursula referred to in her introduction. So please don't forget to donate by text or to use the red button on your screens. Text Remembrance followed by your donation amount to 70450, and that will make all the difference to us. So please don't forget us in that regard. Back to questions, Phil, and the next one is from Darren Little. Within Britain's normal cemeteries, are the Commonwealth War Graves Commission graves looked after by the local councils, or do staff from the Commission go to these places to do maintenance and cleaning?
I think I can answer for my own churchyard in that I can guarantee that there's a great deal of local, direct action to make sure that they are best preserved. But there will be visits at intervals from someone in the regional office just to come and check in. Not necessarily, a bit like Ofsted. You may not necessarily have warning that they'll be coming. So it does act very much down to the local residents, and especially the parochial church council and the church wardens, to make sure it's all right there. In Upper Clatford, I can definitely say they're in good shape.
I think my impression is also that they depend upon local volunteers. I remember being in a graveyard in Sussex on one occasion with my wife, near Lewes this was, and the graveyard actually was very, I would say, badly overgrown. Grass high up the gravestones and so on, and I felt that a flock of sheep could do a lot of useful work in there. And whilst we were there, a couple of volunteers turned up to tend the Commonwealth War Graves. There are about 6, I think, scattered about the graveyard in 2 groups, and they turned up to look after those gravestones. And by the time they'd finished, those gravestones stood out as being properly maintained, properly looked after, and pretty smart, whereas the rest of it continued to look as if it needed a flock of sheep.
Well, it's marvellous to think that there are those levels of support at the very local level. I still have to reflect all the time when you go around any of the cemeteries in mainland Europe, particularly those in France, where I've spent many days looking, the degree to which they are maintained and the perfection of the quality of all the work that's done is a reflection very much on the strenuous efforts of the locally engaged, locally employed working team. 99% of all the work done in the graveyards across Europe is done by local people. And I've spoken to lots of them, and they are delighted with the fact that their work is appreciated in that way. I don't know whether anybody else heard or read, but there was a very recent BBC programme by Yolanda Nell, who had been able, with various sets of permission, to get into the cemetery, of which there are 2 in the Gaza Strip, that rather currently unpleasant area to be doing anything in. The Commonwealth grave site there, containing over 3,500 altogether, mainly from the Ottoman activities of 1916-17. It's tended by currently a father and son and some further members of the local community. The father and son are indeed grandson and great-grandson virtually, because the whole maintenance of that Gaza cemetery started in the 1920s with one man, and it is his son and that son's son who are now leading the charge on it. It's fascinating and a reflection on the sort of dedication that's involved. They've had to do quite a lot of work in the last 10 years with the constant danger and damage from the kind of behaviour that's going on in the Gaza Strip. They've had lots of headstones to replace. Obviously, the manufacture of these headstones comes back to the main office and our headquarters areas, and they are shipped out and replaced. When you go onto a Commonwealth War Graves particular cemetery website listing, it will tell you the language you can expect to be spoken, the precise GPS coordinates so you can find it, rather like the original 1918s, the details of how to get there from the nearest railway station and so on, and any hazards. And the hazards are usually things like, well, very difficult for wheelchair users because of the rough pathways or something. In the Gaza cemetery, it says simply, hazard and regular visits from missile strikes and explosions. So, you've got to be pretty keen to go there at all. And in fact, you'll need to have very careful and well-arranged permissions. But the BBC got in there, and it's a terrific report. And I do recommend searching it out on your various websites, called The Gaza Family Tending World War Graves for 100 Years. Very good. Last week.
This question about maintenance has started a little conversation, which you don't know about, Phil, but I know about. Because Darren asks, Darren Little, who started this particular ball rolling, if they are damaged, scruffy, overgrown, etc., who do we contact about getting it sorted out? Henry Spilberg, a trustee of the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, says the Commonwealth War Graves Commission runs the Eyes On, Hands On programme. to help local volunteers maintain sites, and he gives a website. And so that's a little conversation which has started up now. And,
well, there we are.
And actually, it's something that will occur to all of us who visit the various cemeteries around the place, because at our age we tend to gravitate towards cemeteries as a place to go and see. So you may well have that information useful. Michael Montague has just complimented you on your talk. A huge thank you for such a fascinating talk. I've never failed to be impressed by the devoted care and the compassion of the locally employed staff that maintain these wonderful sites.
Well, here.
We might just return, if we could, to the question of damage and, dare I say it, vandalism, which occurs from time to time, and we've seen reports of this in various places. I know that there was quite a lot of damage and vandalism in Iraq, at sites in Iraq, at Libya at various times. This must be a constant worry for the Commission.
Yes, undoubtedly it is, and I'm sure the key word here is patience. Most of these vandalism activities tend to take place at moments of stress in the local area, perhaps, outrage of one kind or another that suddenly blows over, and they take it out on something innocent and nearby, like a cemetery that is not of their kind, shall we say. And therefore the Commission will be notified of damage, and probably under the immediate circumstances will be able to do nothing at all. In the case of this Gaza site, for example, those dedicated family men do keep an eye on things, but obviously they may find it impossible to get in and do any repairs at all for quite some time. I recall having had that long session of attaché duty in Russia. The Commonwealth graves there, particularly the 3 in Murmansk and the 1 in Archangel, because of the way things were in the Cold War and straight on into the 90s, there'd been very little possibility for the Commission itself or representatives from, for example, the embassy or the consulate in St. Petersburg to do more than visit very occasionally and report back. Very little access was provided. The cross of sacrifice, which is that central feature of all normal cemeteries, the great bronze sword that sits in the middle of that, as I showed on the slide, was just too good a target for the metal thieves of North Russia, and so that was lifted away. Eventually, when moods changed and relations opened up again in the early 90s, mid-90s, when I was going up there more often, the Commission was able to get in and to replace it. Oh. And again, the general maintenance of that particular cemetery in Archangel had been lamentably mismanaged, because no one's been able to get in it and the responsibility was never clear. But I would have to really commend the local authority, particularly the mayor of Archangel, when we took the remains of a British crew, the remains that had been found in 92 from a crash in 1943. The remains had been very carefully identified and all this forensic work had been done, and the time had come to rebury those remains in the Archangel Cemetery, which was now becoming rather more better looked after. And we were very, very, very well supported by the local Russian military, and particularly by the mayor's office, because he made his workman team available to us for the actual construction of the appropriate caskets where the remains could be placed away. And it was done very reverently and very, very thoughtfully, bearing in mind the remains that have been lying around for 50 years are not particularly significant in size, but they were given really excellent final resting place under Russian management. I was very grateful.
Yeah. And of course, we mustn't forget that the local people in whose cemeteries some of these young men lie view these graves as very much their own. There's a search going on at the moment, generated by Kerry Ricketts, who is the granddaughter of John Howard, who commanded D Company of this same regiment, the Oxfordshire Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, at Pegasus Bridge, because one of the villages in which his men, D Company, suffered significantly after D-Day was Escoville in Normandy. And in the cemetery in Escoville lies one man, Private Wilkins of D Company, who was shot and fell into the graveyard. In the process by a sniper, he fell into the graveyard. And I'm pretty sure that at the time there was a bid to place Wilkins into a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery, but the people of Escoville said,
he's ours.
He's our man. He helped with our liberation. And I think that is something that those of us who have never lived under the heel of an occupying force, that's the kind of sentiment which you find in France and places like that.
Yes. How very, very extraordinarily moving. Yes.
Darren Little, who is come back again. There was vandalism this is about the vandalism issue, Phil. Vandalism at my great-uncle's cemetery in Merlo, Netherlands, a couple of years ago, with Nazi swastikas daubed over them.
I remember.
And was quickly cleaned up by local volunteers.
Yes.
I believe to the standard set by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission.
Yeah, I do remember reading about that. And again, it comes back to the thing you just mentioned, that the local community surrounding it, be they French, British, Dutch, or whatever,
they feel a degree of ownership.
Feel that it's part of their life.
Yes, exactly. Clive Rainbow.
Good Lord. Hello, Clive.
In our younger days, he says, you and I, he must mean you, not me, visited many World War I sites associated with the Welsh Fusiliers, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers.
Yes, we did.
Was it that experience that led you to engage so deeply with the marvellous work of the Commission?
I think it must have magnified it, Clive, and good of you to remember. In fact, your memory is obviously getting better these days. Clearly, when you have the sort of structured visit that you and I and dear Leif and so on had, we, I think, focused for a week or so of jollity and seriousness mixed around those parts of France, and I don't think we could have gone away at the end of it without having thought, goodness me, that was great fun, but what a lot of serious stuff we've seen. And I think that you're probably right, it probably did set me going on a rather more focused look at it. I'm bound to say equally that that was in our, as it were, twilight years. We'd been long since retired from uniform when we were on those journeys, but before that there was no shortage ever of access to and requirement to be at cemetery after cemetery after cemetery, some when one's own colleagues had fallen to earth. Yep. And, or indeed even the children. I recall one very, very sad ceremony inside the Berlin cemetery as the young child of one of my airmen was laid to rest in such a setting, such an extraordinary setting. You can't ever go into one of those cemeteries and not come away with at least the vestige of an idea that you've got to keep on thinking about it. So, Clive, yes, indeed, it probably did focus it. I'm glad you mentioned it. I'm glad you can remember it.
Question here from Brian Williams. My father was a soldier in the Coldstream Guards, sent to France in 1940 as an MP, a military policeman.
Yep.
Due to his lifelong time as a policeman, his headstone has him as an MP. Who decides what is carved on the headstone?
Well, the basic wording will, wherever possible, reflect the wishes of the next of kin. The basic shape will always be the same. Let's say we're talking about the standard headstone rather than some of the other arrangements. If we take the standard headstone, the top centre will be a regimental or whatever crest of the organisation, thus a Canadian emblem or a Royal Air Force Wings or the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry emblem or the Oxford Hussars. those will be carefully carved, and those will be set in stone in every sense of the word. I mean, those are inescapable. At the centre of the headstone, there will be, in most cases, a cross symbol, or there may be for the Jewish victim, the Star of David will be in the centre. Then there will be the name, rank, where appropriate, if known, and if wished, and if not wished, sometimes it is, the age of the soldier, sailor, airman, and then the date of his death. Then at the bottom of the headstone, if requested by the family, and at some cost to them, but a very modest cost, their own single extra tribute. You know, he gave his life so that we may live, or something of that kind. That can be placed there, and it's entirely at the family's wish. If you go into the record sheets of the War Graves Commission, you can find where those are annotated and very carefully recorded on the graveside listings. I do recall having studied the antics of an RAF unit that was deployed to North Russia in 1919, where some were lost. I had been researching very carefully the actions of the commanding officer of that squadron, Squadron Leader Graham Donald, and he had written to the father a personal commendation for the good work and the good value of his young, now sadly dead son. And he put a couple of phrases in that letter which the father said, that's him, that's exactly how he should be thought of. And so he just quoted the commanding officer's words as a tribute on the headstone, and with the initials of the commanding officer. So that's a sort of personal level that you can imagine you'll find on the stone. That's the limit. You can't have any fancy other inscriptions. It's number, rank and name, badge of your service department.
I came across one in France once on a rifle brigade headstone, Phil, which I've never forgotten, which was, I'm glad God holds the key to all unknown. If he trusted it to me, I might be sad. Which is quite a lot of...
It's a lot of words.
A lot of words, but it was there.
Yeah. No, I've seen, 3 or 4 line ones.
Yeah.
And as I said, it is at a small cost, but if that's what the family want, then, for heaven's sake, they should have exactly what they want.
Very good. Clive Rainbow again, to say, may I take this opportunity to thank Peggy Ainsworth of the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum for her help when I was researching the stories of the 10 lads from my village, Speen, in Buccaneer,
yes,
during the Great War.
Absolutely, yes, and that's, I hope you're having it more widely published, Clive. More people should see it, not just Speens. There's lots of other people.
There are.
It's a very, very worthwhile book. Super.
Yep. Here's a question for you, which you may not know the answer to, but can modern-day servicemen request to be buried in a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery? I mean, if you live your full
the answer
span,
has to be yes, because my father-in-law is precisely subject to that. He started his boy service in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He finished his wartime and peacetime service in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he worked on as a retired officer in the hospital circuit. He started his service in Shorncliffe. He finished his service and his retired service in Shorncliffe, and he has a headstone there in the Shorncliffe Cemetery, which is a masterpiece of placing, including Chinese labourers down at the bottom of the hill to the left.
Exactly the same shape, the same size, everything is exactly, he's got the same stone everyone else has got.
Absolutely. Make your case, and I can't think the Commonwealth War Graves Commission are going to refuse you.
No. Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I've got another question here, just arrived from Roger Barrett. Was it the case that it was only the United Kingdom which placed a small charge for personal tributes on the headstone, and that the charge was waived if the family couldn't afford the cost?
I'm sure it's not been unique to the United Kingdom. because I can't speak for the other nations. I'm also equally sure that with the charitable nature of everything of this kind, that people would not necessarily have to stump up the money if it really was beyond their means. I think there's a great deal of respect to the family's real wishes. And I'm happy to say that must be always the case.
Yep. Very good. Unless you've got anything else you think we ought to know about tonight, Phil, any other little nugget? I think we're going to draw this to a close, as we've given you a pretty good grilling, really, for the last half hour, 35 minutes or so, on the result of your talk, for which thank you very much. But is there anything else? Because you it's one of these organisations, it seems to me, where every time you look at it, you find something new, something different, something unusual.
Well, I did find a few things new today. Looking at these Queen's Own Oxfordshire Hussars, the queer objects on horseback, there's some very distinguished casualties there. There's only 121 commemorated anywhere in France, another 20 or so in England, a couple in Belgium, a couple in Germany, and indeed one in Ireland in 1919, post-war Irish activity.
Yes. Yep.
One of the most splendidly educated officers, Major Valentine Fleming, Eton, Oxford, elected to be MP for Henley, but nonetheless went to war in 1914 and was killed in action on the 20th of May in 1917, aged 35. A very well-educated man, an MP, but most important, and just as well he survived as long as he did, because he was the father of two boys, one of whom was Ian Fleming. So there'd have been no bond had it not been for Valentine of the queer objects on horseback.
Exactly. There. And you may have come across in your research about what the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum has been doing over the last couple of years. Phil, you may have come across a talk that we had early on in 2021, I guess it was, about Ian Fleming and his background in the Navy. Yeah. So we're very, very pleased to hear.
It's a nice closing of the loop.
It is a very good closing of the loop, and thank you very much for raising Valentine Fleming, who is a hero in our museum, quite right. Darren Little finally says, thank you chaps, enjoyed the presentation and the questions answered, all the best. # lest we forget.
Exactly.
So let's draw things to a close for tonight. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight. I've got a few thank yous to mention before we close down. First of all, to Clive Smith, our filmmaker, cameraman, who's taking a bow out of camera shot. Yeah. And to the Army Flying Museum, who introduced us to Clive in the first place. All the talks we've done over the last couple of years are on the museum's website, so if you're interested, please go and have a look at those. And when you see a talk, you may feel prompted to make a donation, because that's a jolly important part of what this is all about, and we really appreciate that. Thank you very much. We have a sponsor tonight. I mentioned it's an anonymous sponsor, and it makes me think that there may be others out there in the county who would like to support the museum by chipping in towards the making of these films. And if you'd like to think about that, get in touch and have a word with Ursula Corcoran, the museum director, and she'll explain how we might go about getting something together for the sponsorship of one of our online talks. So thank you very much for your donations. I've mentioned that. Our speaker tonight, Air Commodore Phil Wilkinson, bravo.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed for your great efforts on behalf of the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. We've greatly enjoyed meeting you. We'd like to present you as a prize for all your efforts with a copy of this book. I'm not going to give you this book because this is my copy and it's now getting a bit dog-eared, but we're going to send it to you. It's a modern history of the 52nd Light Infantry, that's the 2nd Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, in the Great War, written by Ralph Kite's great-nephew, Simon Harris. And it has the benefit, having only been written in the 1990s, it has the benefit of the internet for his research, and it's a remarkable piece of scholarship, a remarkable history of a most outstanding unit in the Great War, and I think you will thoroughly enjoy it, and I'm not sure you'll probably want to read it at one sitting, but it'll be jolly useful for dipping into. So we'd like to present that to you, and thank you very much indeed for that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Another thank you is to our voiceover, Henry Spielberg, who also cropped up in the questions, and who is a trustee of the museum, who did that voiceover tonight of Garstin? Kenyon, sorry, yeah. Looking forward, our next talk will be on Tuesday the 28th of March. I know that sounds a long way away, but it'll pass in a flash, believe me, when David Roberts and Peter Chamberlain, both young platoon commanders in the 1st Green Jackets, the successor regiment to the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, serving in Borneo as young platoon commanders in the 1960s, early 1960s, during the Malaysian-Indonesian confrontation. We'll tell the story of a difficult ambush in which they both played significant roles. And that's on Tuesday the 28th of March, so very much hope you will join us for that. In the meantime, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Good night.
Good night.